working with TestTrack TCM objects, test cases, and test runs. And there's some quirks to understanding how these types work within SOAP. So I'll start with the steps grid. Steps grid is the primary field on a test case. It contains the test steps, the expected results, comments, which together comprise the entire test case. Within SOAP, these step fields are combined into a single field on the test case utilizing a simple markup language. So each field has a symbol that represents it. You use these symbols at the beginning of a line to indicate what that field is. You have the star for steps, pound for comments, and plus for expected results. This data entry method works exactly like it does on the free form tab on the steps grid itself. So if you've ever played around with that, you'll be very familiar with this. Now, after a test run is generated from a test case, the individual steps can be marked off as completed by appending open bracket, capital Y, close bracket to the end of a step line. Also, you can add a problem statement by beginning a line. Test variants are attributes of test runs that control the variables used within the test. So, for example, you might have an internet browser variant. It's a list of the browsers you need to test against. Although test variants are usually chosen at test run generation time, it can be set explicitly as included or excluded beforehand on a test case. So if, for example, my test case only makes sense on Firefox, I can set it to explicitly only include Firefox as a browser variant. In that same vein, after I've run my test, I may find that I've adequately covered other variants with this single test. I can include these variants as additional variants on that test run. So if my Firefox test actually also worked for Internet Explorer, I could add Internet Explorer as an additional variant. Concepts are represented in SOAP with the C test case variant field and the C test run variant field. Both of these types are derived from the multi-select drop-down field, so really they're just fancy custom fields. The test run field doesn't have any additional members to add, except for those included in multi-select drop-down, but the test case adds an additional type field for whether this variant field was included or excluded. So one final note on variants: the field code defined in the variant can be used within the test case steps. Field code is then expanded in the test run once the actual variant value is known. So let's say in my example, the first step in my test case is opening a browser. I can set the browser field code in the steps so that the actual browser name appears in the test run step. My Firefox test will then read Open Firefox, while my Internet Explorer test reads Open Internet Explorer. So now it's time for our final demo today, incorporating all this event knowledge and TestTrack TCM knowledge. I'm going to be creating a test case, generating test runs from that test case, and creating a defect from a failed test run. Now, normally you'd probably do this all in separate sessions with separate scripts, but I've combined them all together today for this demonstration. All right, so here's our base project. What we're going to do: log into our project, create a test case. We get back the record ID for that test case, generate test runs for that test case. It's going to give us back an array of those test runs. I'm going to run the tests, and if any failed, I'm going to create a defect for that failed test run. So the first thing I need to do is create the test case. Do that here. Okay, so I create a new test case, set the summary, set that it's an automated test. We're running this through SOAP, so we might as well. Set the type as a regression test. This estimated time value is actually the estimated time that's defined on the test case itself. Don't confuse this with an estimate event. The estimated time is a hours, minutes, seconds field, and specify it in this form. Then I'm going to actually set the steps. And if you remember, each line beginning with a star is a step, a plus is an expected result, and a pound is a comment. I'm going through here, and here's all of my steps. After each one, I have a line character. This all gets put together and parsed in TestTrack, and it comes out with a nice steps grid. We'll see that in a minute. Then I'm going to look at the custom fields. I only have one custom field in this case, the preconditions field. It's a multi-line text field, so create that and add that one field to my custom field list. Excuse me. And then I'm going to create a test case variant field. So this test only makes sense on the web client. So my client type variant, I'm setting this variant as included. It should only include the web client type. Other client types, desktop client or mobile. Then I'm going to fill in a event. So create a new event. I set the name. The event name that I'm creating is ready. The notes. So I've approved and I'm ready to run this test. The user who's entering this event, SOAP user, and the date. I'm just saying the date is now. And then add that event to my test case event list. I add that test case and it returns the record ID. So I take that record ID and I return it. Back up here now. Return it out of this function. Now I need to generate test runs for that test case. So down here, generate test runs. It takes a cookie, the test case ID, the test case I'm generating the test runs for, and then an array of C test run variant fields. And then finally here, the test run set. So I need to define all of the variants that I'm going to use when generating these test runs. So the first variant I'm looking at is the browser variant, setting it for Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Opera. All those together into a variant field. Next is the client type. Like we said, we're only going to use web. The operating system, another variant field. Windows, Mac, and Linux, the operating system that we'll test against. We put all of those together into one variant field array. Then we send that to the server to generate the test runs. And that returns a C item to track array of test runs. This is not a list of the actual test run objects. It's just an array of the record IDs of all of the test runs that have been generated. So we take that array and we return it. And the next step here is to actually run those tests. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm only going to run the first test. I'm not going to run all of the tests. And I'm intentionally going to make it fail. So edit test run by record ID. I get from my array of test runs, I'm taking the first record ID here, returning the test run. I'm going to add an estimate event. So I create a new event, set the name to estimate. Now, the estimate event I know from the event definition supports time tracking, so the hours field needs to be filled. So I fill in, this is going to take 4 hours. Set the user and the date. Now I'm going to add a start event. And it's pretty simple. It just takes a name, the name of the event, the username, and that the event happens. Then right here, you use your imagination. Some automated test step somewhere. Now we actually need to mark the first step as completed within our steps grid. So we're going to go and parse and look for the first step. So we look for the star. And then we go to the end of the line. We look for the new line character. So that's the end of that particular line. Now we need to add the open bracket, capital Y, close bracket to indicate that that step's been completed. And for at the end, then append that onto. I'm gonna add a enter work event, and the enter work event is also a time tracking event from the event definition. So I'm gonna look to enter the hours, and the hours that I've spent are actually take the start time, subtract what it is now, and take the total hours, and that's the amount of time I've been working. Then there are two custom fields on the enter work event, percent complete and the remaining time. So I create a percent complete field here, set the name, set the value. In this other custom field, remaining time, and I take what my estimated time was, subtract the amount of work that I've done, and then set the value. And then I'm going to add those custom fields to the custom field array on my event. So that's called field list. Now imagine that some other steps happen in here and one of them happens to fail. So what I need to do now is add a problem statement onto my test run. So on the test run steps, I'm adding problem statement. Problem statements begin on a new line and they exclamation points. I have that right there and the text for the problem statement. I'm going to enter a fail event. So we're going to fail this test run. Create the event, set the name, set the user, set the date. Add all of those events that I just created to the test run event list, and then save it. And then I'm going to return that failed test run ID. So now back here in the main program flow, if we get a failed ID, what we want to do is actually create a defect for that failed test run. So we have a method already that exists that takes a test run and creates a defect from that, filling in a lot of the fields with pertinent information. Fills in our steps to reproduce and the description and the summary. Those are all pre-populated using this create defect for test runs method. So it takes a cookie and the record ID of the test run that you need to generate from. That returns a defect. I'm going to set the type as an automated test failure and then add that defect. So now let's see how all of that comes together. This one, it wasn't from a trigger, so it actually, I'm going to run it from the command line here. So we logged in, generated test runs, returned 9 different test runs. We saved the first one after making some changes and failing it, and then we created a defect from that test run. So let's take a look at the output. So first, here's our test case. Here's our steps, nicely formatted, and you'll notice that we have in the first step a field code for the browser type that we're going to use, and that corresponds to a variant. We have our included variant, which is the web client, and the event that we entered, the ready event. Now we look at our test runs. We have one test run that's completed, and that's the failed test run that we created. Let's take a look at that one. Here in that first step, you'll see that the field code for that variant was replaced with Opera, which is the variant that was used for this particular test run. And here at the bottom, we have a problem statement. The automated test run failed. We look at our variants. We have a bunch of variants there, a bunch of workflow events that we entered. Now, if we go and we look at the defect that was created, see it was created from test run number 1. This is the title of the test run, the summary of the test run, and then here's the problem statement. In our description, it automatically comes in, says the following problems were reported, and just pulls all of the problem statements that you have. And if you look at the steps to reproduce, all of the steps from my test run are there, and the problem is right there in line.